Good morning, everyone. This is just a really short 45-minute to 1 hour lecture, I guess you can call it, but more or less just an information session around the topic of suicide and self-harm. So a few students asked if I would host something around this topic just due to their personal interest or maybe even fears about having to support young people in their classrooms who are managing through really tough stuff. And so I have a little bit of experience in this area that I'm going to talk a little bit about as we get started here. And then we're going to go through some of the resources. We're going to talk about you and your role in supporting yourself to be ready to have these tough conversations should they ever come up. And I'm going to talk briefly around depression, suicide, and self-harm. And as I do that, there's a lot of slides kind of mixed in, or not a lot of slides, but a lot of information kind of mixed in here that I'll invite you to go and look at the PowerPoint later to absorb, because I'm not going to read through all of the things on each slide. I'm just going to talk to either my practical experience or the really important pieces and takeaways from this work to keep it short and sweet. And then talk about, I'll end with some crisis care ideas and strategies for you. And before I get started, I do want to say that if this is something that you're concerned about as an educator, I strongly suggest that you look into some mental health first aid or assist suicide intervention skills training courses. So there are two organizations that I've posted here from which I've received certification annually or biannually in terms of updating training around this topic. So I do have some training in terms of providing mental health first aid and suicide support and intervention, but I also have experience. So as you know, I spent close to 18 or so years in K-12, and 10 years of that was in a community school environment where I taught mostly grade 8. And I didn't have a lot of, I guess, mental health intervention to really do in that environment. And when I did, I had the benefit of an amazing school counselor and social worker mentor who supported me. But what I do have to say about that experience in particular is that we would do a lot of prevention work to mitigate and maybe even lessen the intervention work that might have been needed. So what I mean by that is our school social worker and myself would run groups. We would do boys groups, girls groups, health groups. We would do lunchtime support groups, all kinds of things that invited students to come together and have a safe space to talk about mental health, bullying, things that are on their mind, navigating relationships, social media, those types of things. So all of that prevention work, that upstream work, helped to support issues when they came downstream, because A, we had relationships with the students and we had set up an environment in which students could come to us and they felt safe and supported, and B, we were teaching and role modeling some of the skills needed when we are navigating tough stuff. And sometimes just having those skills or knowing who we can learn those skills from can support us from spiraling downhill when things get really tough. So that's the upstream work that you can do as extracurricular work in your schools. But you can also do this work in your classrooms, as we've talked throughout, by creating safe spaces for students to be able to be open about the things that are on their mind. And so we can be therapeutic in our approach in the classroom and without becoming or needing to become therapists for students who need us. So it's really important that if you're concerned about any of this, that you invest in some of that training. Your school may provide it if you just ask about those opportunities, or look for them yourself and ask for funds to attend some of these trainings. And each one will give you a little bit of a piece of the puzzle to support your growth. No one training is going to ready you for any scenario. However, the more knowledge that you have, the better off you'll be. So these are some of the places that you can go for that kind of training and information. After my time in elementary school, I moved to working in a program out of a high school in Saskatchewan. But the program was supported by Saskatchewan Public Schools and the health region. And so that program was specifically geared towards helping students who were in who needed sort of tier or level 5, tier 3 interventions. So they were at moderate to severe risk of self-harm, suicide, mental health concerns and issues in their homes and families and for themselves, or having a high degree of absenteeism or behavior concerns in school. So students would be referred to that program. And I worked there for 7 or 8 years. And in that part of my professional experience, I did do a lot of suicide first aid, mental health first aid, suicide intervention, assisting students through really tough stuff and supporting intervention plans that help them to maintain their mental health and their wellness, and supported families to manage, again, some of this tough stuff. So I had some frontline, on the ground sort of experience as a teacher, but also as a budding mental health practitioner to support young people and families through some of this stuff. So that's where my practical experience started. And then I moved into acquiring counseling and coursework to support me to be a mental health practitioner. And I do have a designation as a registered therapeutic counselor and a master therapeutic counselor, in addition to my education skills training. So I do or have done private work, one-to-one counseling and supporting people around the notion of suicide and self-harm, as well as other mental health concerns. So that's just a bit about me and what I bring to this topic in terms of experience. And again, this is just a brief overview and an introduction of a very big topic, a very concerning topic in our society. And as educators, we sometimes face this, and I just wanted to bring attention to some of the things that you can be aware of to support yourself to mitigate these conversations. But I really strongly suggest that if this is an area that you want to invest in learning, that you attend some of the local workshops, intensives that focus on this work. There'll be 2 or 3 day intensives, and it will just give you the background knowledge and some of the literacy and just more experience with having these conversations than what I can give you in an hour. So on that note, we'll dive right in here. As I said, I have a few slides and some information and resources around 3 key topics: depression, suicide, and self-harm. And then I'll end with some crisis intervention care to support you. So the first thing I want to speak to is resources. So in our community and in Canada and Saskatchewan, we have a variety of places that people can go to for resources. One of my go-tos is the Canadian Mental Health Association. And then I've got here some information websites that can lead you to resources, toolkits, health supports, assist training, etc. There happens to be an assist training coming up in November. You can see there, if you go to Eventbrite, you can look into some of those options. It is $190. So that's why when I was in a classroom in K to 12, I'd always go to my principal and let them know that I was highly interested in a topic. And if there were funds available, could I attend something? And oftentimes I was met with a yes, which is cool. So you can try to invest in these courses by pursuing those outlets on your own. And sometimes they're even offered by different school divisions for whole staffs or groups. So I've got some links here. If you decide to download the PowerPoint, you can click on, go to some of these websites. Lots of the information I have in today's PowerPoint comes from these websites, so it'll be familiar, but it's good information and very practical knowledge that can just help you to fill your backpack with tools and knowledge for supporting this topic. Another key piece around this in terms of resources is to remember that when you're struggling or working through a tough situation with a student or family member or anybody in your life, really, that there are a lot of resources in our community beyond you. You don't have to be all things to all people. And if you're an educator or a parent, and that's the extent of your role, then you may want to enlist others if you are dealing with either a major trauma or support for someone who is suicidal. And you may want to engage the help of a family physician or contact community mental health resources. I teach my students that we can enlist help from our community, from our coaches or social workers, police officers. There's many people in our community that can help us. And then there's always even the Kids Help Phone. 911, of course, is a number we want to teach our young people. And I've provided a link here to some of the Sask Health Authority services and locations in the province of Saskatchewan that can support you. And as always, I am sure to include, whenever I do workshops with the public or students, information, just making a list or giving a list of things that places we can call or text in a pinch if we need it. And I think it's important to have these lists handy and posted and give them to your students. Obviously, we talk about 911 a lot, but we don't talk so much about 811 or 211, which are services to support other physical or mental health questions that we may have that are non-emergent. Kids Help Phone always has trained staff or volunteers 24/7 to support young people with questions or concerns that they may have. And they can even text the Kids Help Phone, which is really cool, because sometimes we're afraid to make a phone call and actually hear a voice or be vulnerable to another voice on the other end, but texting is a little bit easier for some. So they can text those numbers as well. And then we have Sask suicide prevention hotlines, mobile crisis, which is available to young people and families, and our mental health services, which is available through Saskatchewan Health Authority. And you can contact that intake number if you would like to get on a list for free counseling or supports. Sometimes there is a wait, and especially for children and youth, there can be a wait, but I would give them a call, go through the intake process. At the very least, your name is on a list for free services, and you'll be contacted when there is availability. And sometimes we're in a crisis and we get on a list for something, and then we wait a few weeks or months, unfortunately, and we get a phone call and we feel like we're not in crisis anymore, so we let it go. But I would suggest that if you ever get on a list for services, especially free services, that you take advantage even if you're feeling well or if the person is feeling well, because we can all benefit from having those conversations and forging a relationship with a therapist that we might need them when we're not so strong. And so just like we do self-care practices when we're well, so that we have them for us when we're not, we would want to engage and forge therapeutic relationships when we're well, so that we have them when we're not. And then there's always private counseling and support services that do come at a cost, but many of our EFAP assistant plans through our unions and places of employment will offer a certain number of sessions with psychologists, social workers, or registered counselors like myself, who can help support you through all kinds of mental health issues or concerns. So we want to make sure as educators that we're continually sharing our knowledge about resources available in our community to our families, so that they have lots of exposure to knowing that these resources exist, and then they don't feel maybe so overwhelmed or fearful about reaching out. They have heard you speak to it before, it's familiar information, and people are more apt to reach out when they have exposure to the knowledge of what's available in their community. So that's really key. So some opening messages here before we dive into some of the nitty-gritty around the depression, suicide, and self-harm heavy topics. First of all, you want to take all signs seriously. When it comes to supporting mental health and suicide or self-harm, there's kind of a spectrum of reactions that can happen when we realize that someone is suffering or hurting themselves. One reaction is that you know, from maybe this end of the spectrum, that the person is just attention seeking and we can ignore the behavior and it'll go away. And, you know, it's typical of them to do things to get attention and be provocative with the ways that they manage their emotions. So that's one way that we respond. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's the reaction that is crisis driven. So it's a panic, we've got to call 911 right away, we've got to get to the hospital, we've got to shelter this person from anything and everything that might be bringing them emotional harm or upset, and everybody calls to attention and rallies around the person. Now, both of these reactions are extreme, and what we want to do is build up knowledge so that we find ourselves somewhere in the middle where we can react to this information. When we notice that somebody's behavior is changing or something's happening in someone's life, or maybe we see signs of self-harm, that we can react in a calm, neutral, action-oriented manner. So we're not at one end completely dismissing it as attention-seeking behavior, and on the other hand, we're not completely rallying around and changing the person's entire world and calling 911 immediately or often. So it's just finding that middle ground. But I say that with the caveat that you do want to take all signs seriously. We don't ignore any signs of suicide and self-harm behavior. And I'll get into that a little bit in terms of how you manage and support people when they're struggling. Take the signs seriously, but be calm and neutral and action-oriented in how you follow through. Be aware that as I talk further about this topic, there might be some triggers, and your own self-care is going to be hugely important. The more I am supporting myself, working and walking through my own healing journey, if I have one to do or take, and just generally taking care of my own mental well-being, the better off I'm going to be, or the less triggered I'm going to be if I have to support someone who is in a crisis. We have to remember that people injure themselves in order to send a message to others. And so if we are at the receiving end of that message, then we want to be ready and strong in order to be that person to help them navigate through what they need to navigate through to get supported. So we're going to watch, when we're thinking about this whole topic of depression, suicide, self-harm, what we're going to want to be doing is watching for changes in behavior. We're going to want to be watching for what we call in healthcare maladaptive forms of coping. So these are patterns for coping and supporting ourselves. Sorry, you can hear my cat who's being very loud right now. These are ways that I might seek to have my needs met that are just not appropriate and not positive forms of coping with some of the things that I'm dealing with. So we're going to watch for things, behaviors, attitudes, actions that people do that are counter-intuitive, counterproductive, or maybe different from what we see, deviating from their norm or their baseline when we're paying attention to the needs of someone who might be struggling. The other key thing to remember is that you can provide help or you can get help. So you can be of service to someone who's in a crisis by one of those two things, being there for them or getting them to someone who can help. And as an educator, you're more likely to be the person who's going to be there for them in the short term and get them to help in the long term, because we're not therapists, we are educators, and we have boundaries around our role, but that doesn't mean we can't help get people to the right time and place. Okay. So as I said, I've embedded links you can see throughout this presentation that I invite you to take a look at and do some self-learning, some self-guided inquiry around the topic so you get a little bit comfortable with this topic, because the more comfortable we are about talking about these things, the more we bring our students' attention to these topics, and the more we can either help students unpack things before they get really bad, or we're more comfortable in a crisis. So with self-care, in terms of planning, the first step I'm going to take to plan to be there for someone, intervene in a crisis, is I'm going to take care of me. I'm going to make sure that I can respond to these types of situations calmly. And I'm going to make sure that I'm taking care of my own emotional regulation. I'm doing breathing, yoga, meditation, mindful walking, exercise. I'm eating right. I'm getting the right amount of sleep. All those things we've talked about in terms of self-care that help me regulate my emotions. Because the minute my amygdala gets triggered because of someone else's need, so I realize there's self-harm or suicide ideation going on, I'm going to be triggered and fearful and anxious. That's just a natural part of being a human. And so what I want to be able to do is regulate and calm myself so I can intervene and support the person who's struggling. I won't be able to do that if I haven't done the prep work. So if you're not ready to calmly support or walk someone through a tough situation, what you want to do is reach out and get help immediately. You don't want to be that person if you can't regulate your own emotions. And in order to do that, we want to build up resilience, right? So we've talked about rating our resilience in this course and what are areas that we're weaker and stronger, so we know where to focus. So what you want to be doing as an educator is focusing in areas where you're weak so that you can build your resilience and your capacity to cope for yourself, number one, but also your capacity to help someone who might be struggling, who might be less resilient. Knowledge is power in this case. So the more courses, the more training, the more self-guided inquiry you do around this topic to learn and grow yourself, the better off you'll be in supporting someone. And you need to know your resources. So have a handy pick list of resources like the slide that I showed previous, post it up in your classroom. You might never need it, but if it's there, you have it and you can share it with students, and students are aware that you're aware that people need resources sometimes in times of trouble or crisis. So I call this planning. And what I would do is rate your readiness in these areas as a very first step. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how am I in terms of managing my emotions? 1, I never manage my emotions well at all. 5, I always manage my emotions very well. How resilient am I? Same 1 to 5 scale. Knowledgeable in terms of this topic, and how much do I have access to resources that I can share with others. In areas where you're low, if you rate yourself in each of these areas, I would suggest doing some work if this is a topic of interest or a worry of yours, and make sure that you're arming yourself to be ready once you've done that rating. Then you follow through with a plan. So you do the prevention work that I talked about earlier, like I did with my school social worker and counselor. They're always available to help get you going, to run groups and support students with safe places to talk and gather. Do any of the preparation and prevention work you can do for yourself to bring the types of conversations to your classroom that are in support of mental health, talking about it, demystifying, destigmatizing, all that stuff. We want to be ready and have those great conversations well upstream of any issues that might come later. We're going to do the learning. We're going to take actions for ourselves. That's the emotion regulation piece and taking care of me so I can take care of others. And we're going to figure out next steps. So if we run into a situation that's difficult, we support someone maybe through noticing self-harm or suicide ideation, and we stumble through that and it's pretty rough, then what you want to do is learn from that and figure out what your next steps are, always for growth. So then we want to teach and be. So we are educators. We want to be mentally healthy ourselves. We want to bust the myths of mental health by talking about all of the appropriate things that we can share and in terms of resources and demystifying stigma and just breaking down the walls of conversations around mental health. We'll provide our students with strategies to de-stress and do self-care. So you'll maybe take some of the learning you have from this course and you'll bring it to your students and help them to manage their own mental wellness through health activities, art therapy activities, physical education activities. There's all kinds of ways: journaling, writing, reading, lots of ways that we can bring these strategies to our students in the classroom. We're going to model self-care. So I'm going to talk to my students about ways that I take care of myself, and they're going to see me eating healthy food, doing healthy activities in the school, in the classroom, maybe even in the community. And I'm going to just try to be that role model for my students and live healthfully and promote wellness through my own engagement with emotional and social learning, and just creating that safe space in our classroom. So with that being the place to start, I'm going to get into a little bit around depression, suicide, and self-harm. Again, these topics might be triggering, difficult to manage or listen to a little bit. So I would challenge you to do the self-care work, even stop here and go back and do the self-care work before continuing if you're watching this as a recording. And just be aware if you need to pause and take breaks as we go through some of this stuff through to the end of crisis care. Okay, that's really, really important that you're ready. That's step number one in this. If it was a 3-step process, number one would be I am ready because I've done the work to care for myself and regulate and build resilience. Number 2 would be I've attended some training or a mini workshop like this and I'm starting to build knowledge, and that's piece along with the self self-care piece is ongoing and continuous throughout our lives. So I've done the self-care, I'm building awareness and knowledge, and then I know how to manage in a crisis. And I continue to grow as I go through those 3 steps, I guess, so to speak. So as I said, I'm not going to get into all that is on these slides. I'm just going to bring them to your attention because there's a lot here that you could dig into yourself in terms of just doing the reading, absorbing the knowledge and the learning. But when we're supporting, first thing we want to remember when we're supporting mental health for our students or anyone really is that it's not our job to diagnose. We are not doctors or medical professionals. Our job is only to seek professional supports and opinions. So we're not using this knowledge to diagnose anybody, including ourselves. That's the worst thing we can do, is go to Dr. Google or refer back to a training we took and start thinking that it's our role to diagnose ourselves or others. That's not our job. These are awareness pieces, not diagnostic information pieces. So that's key up front. But what you want to do when you're thinking about wondering about someone who might be struggling is just paying attention to changes in behavior, or even just a sense of negativity, sadness, loss, changes in sleep patterns, and even interest in life and hanging out with friends, or even just sometimes learning, ability to problem solve. Sometimes someone who's very apt at problem solving, if they're suffering from depression or they're feeling a little bit depressed or sad or down, they have a lot of difficulty analyzing or solving problems when they normally can do that quite well. Or this tendency to blame themselves for a lot of things, over apologizing, trying to make up for, or just blaming and shaming towards self. So those are things we want to watch for when we're wondering if someone might be depressed or feeling down and needing some support. So signs or symptoms of depression, there could be many. They can be behavioral, emotional. They can come in many different shapes or forms. And certainly this is not an exhaustive list, or the next few lists are not exhaustive. They're just speaking to some of the things that you might see. So you might see increase in use of alcohol or other drugs, changes in patterns of behavior with respect to attendance or schoolwork. You might see bad behavior, or what we call as bad behavior, being more overt with our actions, harmful towards others or ourselves. You might see promiscuity, maybe in a teenager or a young adult or an adult. You might see more fighting, bullying, all kinds of things that just lead us to believe that something's not right with that person or in their life. And we might want to question what's behind the behavior, like we would in any scenario where we're seeing something that's out of the norm or deviating from either norms of society or that person, or what you expect or typically see from that person. And another thing that we want to remember is that although individuals' motives for suicide vary, there are some common warning signs, and these may indicate that someone is at risk or is having personal, family, or school problems. And typically, suicides do not occur without these warnings. So if you ever hear of a story, you know, it happened out of nowhere, it was completely unexpected, typically, and unfortunately, if you go back in hindsight, you can learn and unpack the pieces of that person's struggles where there were signs and symptoms of either self-harming behavior or activities they were engaging in, or emotional signals that this person was in fact struggling. So if we're aware of what the warning signs can be, physical, emotional, behavioral, we can recognize when to help somebody and intervene before there is a crisis. Some of the physical signs might just be neglecting my own personal appearance, changing the way I dress, chronically being ill, or complaining of aches and pains and headaches and things like that, or even a sudden change in my appetite, weight gain, weight loss, things like that. Again, we're not going to be diagnosing these as symptoms of depression or signs of depression. They're just awareness pieces. So that's really key that we remember that. Emotional cues might be a sense of hopelessness, helplessness. Maybe I'm not enjoying time with my friends anymore as much as I used to, or I'm having extreme mood changes or sudden outbursts, feeling overly tired or anxious often. Sometimes people who are suffering from depression or not feeling good about themselves lose the ability to concentrate, and they may have even a sense of guilt, shame, failure, self-destructive thoughts, dark thoughts, exaggerated fears of illness or death, or feeling worthless. So these are just some of the emotional things. And we can honor these emotional pieces just even with the notion that sometimes we all have dark thoughts. You know, dark thoughts aren't necessarily a bad thing. Our minds are wandering all day long and we're exposed to all kinds of things. So sometimes, you know, I even tell students that, you know, we can have dark thoughts about something, but it doesn't mean that we're a bad person or that we're considering acting on them. Where we would want to draw attention to those dark thoughts is if we did feel like taking steps to act on those dark thoughts. But dark thoughts can come and go. So we just want to be careful in terms of how we think about or speak about some of these things. Behavioral changes, again, I'm not going to read through all this because some of it's a little bit repetitive, but even on a more extreme end, you might see someone spending a lot of time alone, giving away prized possessions, or even sudden changes to their personality. Those might be things you really would want to pay attention to and be maybe a little bit concerned about. Where you would want to be highly vigilant is in terms of if a person was making a will or writing very dark poetry or stories about suicide or death. Sometimes our young people will post on social media things about suicide and self-harm. If you notice that someone was hoarding pills or hiding weapons, you would want to be very concerned about that. Or if there had been previous suicide attempts. Again, these are just things that might heighten our sense of worry and our need to support the person if we were already seeing other signs and symptoms and then these things started happening. A note here that a person may be more inclined to think about suicide or go and take unnecessary risks when under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or when there is a loss of a relationship. So those are the most common factors. So what if you're worried about someone and you're noticing that there's an increased use in substance abuse, or there's been a recent breakup or relationship loss, you really want to make sure that you have supports to rally around that person and get them to people who can be there for them, because those are often triggers just prior to suicidal behavior. So the Canadian Mental Health Association takes these warning signs and puts them into the acronym is path warm. So again, I'll invite you to look at this later if you want a way to remember this, or if you want something to keep by your desk to help you pay attention. But these are just, again, some of the warning signs and symptoms collated into a nice list that helps to remind us of some of the things we want to watch for if we're worried about somebody. So suicide intervention. So how do you help in terms of supporting somebody? Now, I want to note here that this is a lot to digest. So I want you to go to the PowerPoint, review this later. What I'm going to do is collate this list with an action plan that you can take practically to a crisis experience at the end of this. So in terms of this list, again, the big bottom line for all of these pieces is do not discount somebody reaching out or drawing attention to suicidal behavior, actions, or thoughts. You want to listen, and you want to empathize and get that person to support in a calm, rational, action-oriented way. So like I said, I'm not going to go through this list, but I'm going to come back to some key pieces from that list in a more succinct way at the end. So I want to speak a little bit about self-harm because it is unique and different than suicide. Supporting suicide. Self-harm is really somebody's way of actually coping. So it's a measure that people take to maybe avoid dealing with their depression or having suicidal thoughts. So In fact, on one hand, we can honor the fact that the person is taking steps to try to cope. It's just that this coping is maladaptive, meaning it's not helpful and it's not supportive of wellness or getting better. So self-injury means that someone hurts themselves on purpose but doesn't intend to end their life in most cases. Common acts of self-injury include cutting, burning, hitting yourself, preventing wounds from healing, so like picking scabs continually. Self-harm can also come in the form of eating disorders or different forms of body dysmorphia, ways that young people might want to punish themselves or turn off their emotional pain by taking their power and control back in other areas. Sometimes quite literally and psychologically speaking, causing physical pain to the body can create a bit of a euphoria, and it can become addictive, that sense of euphoria that is felt. And so what can start as a maladaptive coping can become a bit of an addiction or a pattern or something that we just do like a habit. So there's many forms of self-harm, and it's again a spectrum or an array of behaviors that are most often taken upon in order to mitigate some emotional upset. So I've linked you to a document that you can investigate further that topic if you're interested. But how can you help? So if you're concerned about someone, it's okay to ask about the self-injury, as I'm going to talk in a minute about suicide. Asking a person about their thoughts on suicide or self-harm are not going to perpetuate the behavior. The research speaks loud and clear around that. We're not going to convince them to commit an act of harm against themselves by talking about it. So that's just a consideration when it comes to addressing these issues head on and very directly in a very connected and engaged, empathic way. We can talk about the hurt that's happening and support people to find more adaptive ways of coping. Potentially, we want to avoid demanding that the person stop. We want to avoid guilting or shaming. We just want to seek support for them or even ourselves. If we can't stop somebody from engaging in a behavior that we see as harmful, then we want to make sure that we're supporting ourselves to cope and manage with that without forcing that person to get help or demanding that they make changes to their behavior. We would just want to take care of us and provide all of the wellness, role model, teaching being aspects that hopefully that person might feel like they could come to us when they're ready to seek support. We do want to draw attention to this. If we're a teacher and we see it in a classroom, we would want to bring it to our administrator or our school counselor or social worker, because they're trained to hopefully mitigate and manage what the needs of the student might be. But our role might be just providing that positive classroom atmosphere and an emotionally safe space, and showing other ways to cope. So that might be where I'm talking about managing my own stress or my own emotional trauma through positive and healthy ways. And I'm not preaching that others do the same. I'm just sharing what I would do to support myself during a tough situation. And other students around me might absorb that knowledge if it speaks to them. So this is one of the last slides here in terms of crisis support. Here's what we want to be able to do if we believe that we are managing a crisis. We believe that someone is suicidal. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to assess the risk. So this LG acronym that's in the top right of the screen here comes from the ASSIST training. And this is a 2 or 3 day training that you would want to take. So I'm not going to do this process justice in 5 minutes. However, there are some important takeaways from this process that I think you should know. So the first is to ask and be direct. And what I say and what I have said with students is, are you thinking about suicide? Or are you thinking about hurting yourself? I use the language that is direct and speaks to exactly what I am asking about. The next thing I'm going to do is assess if there is a plan and if there are means. So if the student says, yes, I am thinking about suicide, then I would ask them, do you have a plan? I would hear out the plan. I would be empathetic, and I would listen non-judgmentally. And then I would assess the means. So if the student spoke specifically about using a weapon or using pills or a substance or something that was part of their plan, I would assess whether or not they actually had the means to follow through with that. So are there knives kept in the home? Is there rope or pills or alcohol accessible to the child or the person? What are the means that they have for which they could follow through with this act should they choose? So if they do not have a plan, then I'm going to go directly to making a plan to stay safe for now. We call it stay safe for now, because it's not about getting the person to commit to never committing this act against themselves, because sometimes that in and of itself can be extremely overwhelming. If I'm going to make promises that I can't keep, that might cause me to feel shame and guilt. So as someone who's helping this person through their tough situation, I'm just going to get them to commit to a plan to stay safe for now. That might look like a plan to stay safe overnight until I see you the next day at school. This might be a plan to get through the weekend, and we're going to write out that plan and we're going to run through it. Now, I have done this as an educator and a mental health practitioner with young people, working in a, like I said, Tier 3 intervention program with students who are moderately or severely at risk of self-harm, suicide, and mental health or behavior issues or concerns. I don't know that I would be comfortable running through this plan as a teacher in a classroom, even if I had the education and the training. I would only be using this if I absolutely had to, like I had no other supports available to me. If I did have supports available to me, I might work through this plan as someone who's close to the child with a school social worker or counselor present, or my administrator present, okay? So I'm not giving you these tools to go out and start using them on your own with students or families. You're going to use them with a student or a loved one when or if you're in a crisis and you're the only one available to help. So if there's the risk is low, then you're going to make a plan for staying safe for now. If the risk is high, then you're going to get help or go to emergency. So if you're talking to a young person and yes, they're thinking of suicide, yes, they have a plan and they have the means by which they can follow through with the plan relatively soon, you're going to go to emergency. So in the kindest way possible, you're going to let the person know that you care about their well-being and you would like to take them to a place that can help them. You would want to get family involved, social work support, whomever else that you have in your community or your building to get that person to the right place to get that care, that emergent care. And again, no plan. We'll make a plan to stay safe for now. And we talk about being excited about the things that we're going to do and feel and be when we get together the next time. So it might be that tomorrow there's a field trip and I'm going to be really excited to see you back at school tomorrow. And you have all these resources. What you're going to do with the Stay Safe for Now plan is make sure that they have some fun activities they can engage in, some ways to manage their stress and cope. They have supports, people they can reach out to. They've got that list of resources that they can call should they find themselves in a sticky situation over the weekend or over the night, and that there are people you've communicated this plan with in the home of that child or the place of that child's residence, so that they have others in the know of the plan who can be checking in. You wouldn't just send a child off with this plan and not talk to anybody about it. That's so key that you involve the people in this person's life to help keep a watchful eye on this plan as well. While we're doing this, we're going to give lots of compassion and resources, reassurance that the person can seek help, that there's no shame or blame in reaching out for help. We're going to demystify all of this by being very literal and direct about what the resources are for support. The plan is going to be clear. The people and the places that can support are going to be clear. We might even, if we're having a conversation with this young person, if we have their attention, share a story or make a connection that is appropriate, that helps them to understand that a lot of people have to manage tough stuff, or that depression or anxiety affects us too, you would only want to divulge as much as you were comfortable with and as much as was appropriate. So if you take some of these trainings, you work through some activities that help you to be able to understand what those boundaries are. And it's kind of 50-50. You're going to decide your boundaries for yourself as well, but you're also going to remember the boundaries that are expected of you in your role. And you may need to ask your school administrator or your school social worker or counselor to provide you with assistance in understanding those boundaries. Ask questions. Always ask questions when it comes to these types of tough situations that you may need to navigate. So what you're going to do following, and as I started with, preceding any kind of crisis intervention, is self-care. So you might take your wellness wheel or your medicine wheel philosophy, or any form of sort of unpacking or brainstorming or mind mapping the pieces of your self-care puzzle. And you're going to make sure that you're meeting them in a balanced way. And then you'll be hopefully ready to be that person who someone can reach out to if they're struggling, and you have some tools and tips to support you through that. So I have a link here to mental health first aid, should you want to reach out to that organization for more supports or to take a training course, okay? But the bottom line is, if you're in crisis and you don't know what to do, always call 911 or always go to the emergency. There's no harm done if you make a mistake in that regard. It'll just be that you reacted out of more fear for crisis than you did out of thinking that it was just a cry for attention, and that's okay. That's the angle that we want to go in a worst case scenario if we're going to go in any direction. And make sure that, as I said, if you have a plan or support in place, that that person has resources other than you in the community, in their home, in the school, to help this. None of us carry this burden by ourselves. None of us should carry this burden alone. Make sure that we have those pieces of the puzzle in place. And if you're wondering what kinds of supports you can help the student put in place in terms of their plan when they're making their plan for staying safe for now, you want to talk about activities that are calming. They can maybe do reading or journaling. If they like to work out or walk or run, spend time with their dog or their pet. That's one I often use, is spending time with a pet or even a loved one, connecting with a friend on the phone or through Zoom or Skype. And just basically the places that the person can go to for self-support, close familial support and relationships, and then outside resources. Having those three pieces, self, home, and community supports available. And then, as I said, I'll end where I started, with making sure that we attend to all of these manners in a brief, neutral and calm and action-oriented way. So even if the person is going to be safe, our action is a stay safe for now plan. If the person is not going to be safe, then action towards getting crisis care or support. And that brings us to the end. So that was hopefully 45 minutes to an hour. And as I said, a brief overview. It's only an introduction. I strongly encourage and urge you to seek out as much training as you can. Take every opportunity to have these courageous conversations so that we're not reacting on one end, making presumptions or assumptions about seeking attention behavior, and we're not reacting out of crisis all the time as well. That we're staging ourselves towards some middle ground where we can be comfortable supporting others and give them appropriate and healthy ways to support themselves through crisis. All right, take care, and thank you for joining me today.